You'd think eating a rotting carcass crawling with bacteria that could kill a human in hours would be a death sentence for any animal. Here's the uncomfortable part. For vultures, hyenas, and a handful of other species, it's just lunch. And the reason isn't luck or magic immunity. It's one of the most extreme biological upgrades in the entire animal kingdom. So let's actually ask the question properly. What is physically happening inside these animals that lets them eat meat crawling with pathogens that would put a human in intensive care, or worse, within hours? Because the honest answer isn't that these animals simply don't get affected by bacteria. It's that they've evolved an entire layered defense system, stacked one on top of another, specifically built around the fact that their survival depends on eating food nothing else wants to touch. Before getting into how these animals survive it, it's worth understanding exactly what makes rotten meat dangerous in the first place. Because spoiled isn't one single threat, it's actually several distinct chemical and biological processes happening simultaneously. As bacteria break down proteins in decomposing meat, they produce compounds called biogenic amines, including one you may have actually heard of, histamine. In large enough quantities, these compounds can cause a genuinely severe reaction in humans, sometimes called scombroid poisoning, involving flushing, rapid heartbeat, and, in serious cases, dangerous drops in blood pressure. Separately, certain bacteria that thrive in decomposing tissue, particularly in low oxygen conditions like the interior of a large carcass, produce botulism toxin, widely considered one of the most potent biological toxins known to science, capable of causing paralysis and death in extremely small doses. Anthrax, meanwhile, isn't actually a byproduct of decomposition itself. It's a bacterial spore that can already be present in an animal at the time of death, particularly in certain grazing regions, and remains a genuine threat to anything that consumes the carcass afterward. Layered on top of all of this is the simple, massive bacterial load itself. Decomposing tissue becomes an increasingly dense breeding ground for pathogenic bacteria, including various Salmonella and E. coli strains, multiplying rapidly the longer a carcass sits exposed to warmth and time. For a human, exposure to any one of these threats in sufficient quantity can be genuinely life-threatening. For a vulture, all of them, often simultaneously, are just Tuesday. Let's start with vultures because they represent the single most extreme example of this adaptation in the entire animal kingdom. A vulture's stomach acid is astonishingly strong, with a pH low enough to be genuinely corrosive, strong enough, according to researchers who've measured it, to dissolve bone and, under the right conditions, even certain metals over time. For comparison, human stomach acid is itself fairly strong, but a vulture's digestive environment operates at an entirely different level of extremity, roughly 10 to 100 times more acidic depending on the specific measurement and species. That level of acidity isn't just about breaking down tough material like bone and hide efficiently, it functions as a brutally effective sterilization chamber, destroying the vast majority of bacteria, viruses, and parasites before they ever have a chance to establish themselves in the vulture's body. But stomach acid alone doesn't tell the whole story. And this is where things get genuinely fascinating. Researchers studying vulture microbiomes, the communities of bacteria living in their digestive tracts, have found something remarkable. Vulture gut bacteria populations are dramatically less diverse than those found in most other birds and mammals. And that's not a weakness, it's a specialized strength. Instead of hosting a broad, general-purpose community of gut bacteria, vultures appear to host a highly selective population dominated by bacteria specifically adapted to survive and even thrive in an extremely acidic, toxin-heavy environment. Essentially, the vulture's gut has been colonized almost exclusively by microbial specialists that can handle exactly the conditions found in rotting carcasses, while the pathogens that would sicken almost any other animal simply can't establish a foothold in that same hostile internal environment. There's a genuinely important immune system layer sitting underneath all of this that deserves its own attention because stomach acid and gut bacteria only handle part of the threat. Researchers studying vulture genetics have found evidence of specific adaptations within genes related to immune function, suggesting vultures may have evolved a heightened, more aggressive, innate immune response compared to many other birds, essentially a faster, more sensitive first line of defense that can identify and neutralize threats that make it past the acidic gut environment. This layered approach, extreme acid first, specialized bacteria second, an unusually responsive immune system as a third line of defense, helps explain why vultures don't just survive exposure to dangerous pathogens occasionally. They do it as an absolute daily routine without apparent consequence. This connects to something even more specific and genuinely remarkable: the vulture's apparent resistance to some of the deadliest toxins known to science, the exact botulism toxin and anthrax spores we just covered. Both are routinely present in the decaying carcasses vultures feed on, and yet documented cases of vultures actually being sickened or killed by these specific toxins are extraordinarily rare. Researchers studying this have proposed that the combination of extreme extreme stomach acidity, a highly specialized gut microbiome, and this heightened immune response works together to neutralize these toxins before they can cause the kind of damage they'd cause in a human body, though the exact mechanisms are still an active area of ongoing research. What's clear is that vultures aren't simply tolerating exposure to these toxins the way a slightly hardier human might. They're operating with a fundamentally different internal chemistry, one specifically shaped by millions of years of evolutionary pressure toward a diet that essentially nothing else wants. Hyenas offer a genuinely different but equally compelling version of this same underlying story. Unlike vultures, which are almost exclusively scavengers, hyenas both hunt and scavenge, meaning their bodies have had to evolve tolerance for an even wider range of potential pathogens, fresh kills, old carcasses, bone, and everything in between. Research into hyena digestive biology has found that, like vultures, hyenas possess remarkably strong stomach acid, capable of breaking down and sterilizing material that would overwhelm most other mammals. Hyenas are also famous among researchers for their ability to consume and fully digest bone, something relatively few mammals can do efficiently, which requires not just strong acid, but a digestive tract genuinely built to handle material far tougher and more contaminated than typical mammalian prey. Studies of hyena gut bacteria have similarly found populations shaped specifically around handling decomposing bacteria-laden food sources, reinforcing the same basic evolutionary pattern seen in vultures: extreme dietary specialization producing an extreme, tightly matched internal defense system. It's worth pulling in a genuinely different kind of animal here for contrast, because the same basic principle, extreme diet requiring extreme internal defenses, shows up in creatures that look nothing like vultures or hyenas. Komodo dragons, the largest living lizards, have long been the subject of scientific fascination regarding their mouths and digestive systems, largely because of their diet, which frequently includes carrion in various stages of decomposition. For years, an older, now largely revised theory suggested Komodo dragon bites were dangerous primarily because of an exceptionally toxic bacteria-laden mouth. More recent research has shifted this understanding somewhat, identifying that Komodo dragons actually possess a genuine venom gland, meaning their bite's danger comes from a more complex combination of venom and opportunistic bacterial infection, rather than bacteria alone. Regardless of the exact mechanism, what remains true is that Komodo dragons regularly consume heavily decomposed meat without the kind of illness that would affect most other animals. Again, pointing to a highly specialized digestive and immune system built specifically around processing food that's already well into the decomposition process. Sharks provide yet another angle on this same underlying evolutionary pattern, this time from an entirely different ecosystem. Certain shark species are known to scavenge on dead or dying marine animals, sometimes in advanced states of decomposition, and researchers studying shark immune systems have found genuinely unusual features, including antimicrobial compounds in shark tissue and blood that appear to provide broad protection against a wide range of pathogens. Sharks have existed as a lineage for an extraordinarily long evolutionary time span, several 100 million years, and during that entire span, scavenging opportunistically on decomposing marine carcasses has likely been a consistent part of many species' survival strategy, creating sustained evolutionary pressure toward exactly this kind of robust, broad-spectrum internal defense system. Now here's where it's worth pausing to ask the obvious follow-up question. If evolution can build this level of protection into vultures, hyenas, Komodo dragons, and sharks, why didn't humans get anything close to this same level of tolerance? The honest answer comes down to diet and evolutionary pressure, or more specifically, the lack of it. Human ancestors were never primarily obligate scavengers of heavily decomposed carcasses the way vultures are, while early hominins likely did scavenge to some degree. As we've covered in earlier videos on this channel, that scavenging behavior existed alongside hunting, gathering, and eventually cooking, meaning the evolutionary pressure toward developing extreme stomach acidity and specialized pathogen-resistant gut bacteria simply never reached the same intensity it did in species whose entire survival strategy depended on eating what nothing else would touch. Evolution doesn't build capabilities a species doesn't consistently need, and humans, across most of our evolutionary history, had other viable food strategies available that didn't require this level of extreme internal defense. This is actually where something genuinely fascinating comes comes into focus. Because humans didn't skip this problem entirely, we just solved it externally instead of internally. Where a vulture's body does the work of neutralizing dangerous pathogens through internal biology, human ancestors eventually developed fire and cooking, which accomplishes a remarkably similar outcome through an entirely different mechanism, using external heat rather than internal acid and specialized bacteria to destroy the same categories of dangerous microorganisms. In a genuine sense, cooking functions as humanity's externalized version of a vulture's stomach, a technological workaround that let our ancestors safely process food that would otherwise carry real infection risk, without requiring the same extreme internal biological specialization. This is part of why humans can safely eat meat that would be genuinely risky raw. Properly cooking it destroys the same bacteria a vulture's stomach acid would destroy internally, just using an external tool instead of an internal adaptation. There's also a genuinely interesting trade-off worth mentioning here, because this kind of extreme internal defense system isn't free. Maintaining stomach acid strong enough to dissolve bone, and a specialized low-diversity gut microbiome built around surviving in that harsh environment comes with real biological costs and constraints. A digestive system this extreme is highly specialized for a very particular kind of food source, and specialization in biology almost always involves trade-offs elsewhere. Vultures, for instance, have relatively limited dietary flexibility compared to more generalist scavengers. Their entire digestive system is essentially optimized around one specific ecological niche. Humans, by contrast, evolved toward broad dietary flexibility, the ability to eat an enormous range of different food types across wildly different environments, which almost certainly came at the cost of the kind of narrow, extreme specialization that would let us safely process heavily rotten meat the way a vulture can. This connects to something worth understanding about your own gut health today, because the underlying principle, that gut bacteria composition dramatically shapes what your body can safely process, still applies directly to modern human digestion, just operating within a much narrower safety margin than a vulture's. Your gut microbiome is shaped by what you regularly eat, and while humans will never develop anything close to a vulture's tolerance for decomposition, the same basic biological logic, specific bacteria populations adapting to handle specific dietary conditions, is quietly happening inside you right now, just calibrated for a completely different, much more conservative range of food safety than the one vultures operate within. There's also a broader ecological point worth making here, because vultures and hyenas aren't just biological curiosities, they perform a genuinely critical function within their ecosystems precisely because of this extreme tolerance. By rapidly consuming and effectively neutralizing carcasses that would otherwise sit and decompose for extended periods, spreading disease and attracting other pathogen risks, scavengers like vultures act as a kind of biological cleanup and disease containment system for the entire surrounding environment. This isn't just a theoretical benefit either. There's a well-documented, genuinely sobering real-world case study that demonstrates exactly how critical this role is. Beginning in the 1990s, vulture populations across India collapsed catastrophically, with some species declining by more than 90% within just a few years, caused by a veterinary drug used to treat livestock that turned out to be lethally toxic to vultures feeding on the carcasses of treated animals. The consequences extended far beyond simply losing vultures. Without vultures rapidly processing livestock carcasses the way they always had, carcasses were left to decompose in the open for far longer, and feral dog populations which stepped in to fill the ecological gap expanded dramatically. Researchers studying the aftermath found direct correlations between the vulture population collapse and increased rabies transmission risk tied to the growing feral dog population, along with broader concerns about disease spread from carcasses that were no longer being processed quickly and safely. In other words, an adaptation that looks almost grotesque from a human perspective, the ability to eat things crawling with anthrax and botulism, turned out to be quietly protecting an entire country's disease environment, and when that adaptation was accidentally removed from the ecosystem, the consequences were measurable, serious, and directly tied to human and animal health outcomes. So the picture that emerges here isn't really about vultures, hyenas, Komodo dragons, and sharks being somehow tougher or more resilient than humans in some generalized sense. It's about extraordinarily specific, narrowly targeted evolutionary adaptations, extreme stomach acidity, specialized low-diversity gut microbiomes, heightened immune responses, and in some cases unique immune compounds, all built with laser precision around one specific ecological need: safely processing food in a state of decomposition that would be lethal to almost anything else. Your body never developed this because your evolutionary history never demanded it in the same relentless, singular way. You inherited a digestive system built for flexibility and variety instead, paired with an external technological solution, fire and cooking, that accomplishes a remarkably similar outcome through entirely different means. A genuinely different trade-off, optimized for an entirely different survival strategy. So the next time you see a vulture calmly tearing into a carcass that would put you in a hospital bed within hours, or watch footage of a hyena crunching through bone that's been sitting in the sun for days, don't think of it as some kind of biological invincibility. Think of it as one of evolution's most extreme, most specific solutions to one of nature's most persistent problems. What to do with all the death that scavengers and the ecosystems around them quietly depend on someone being able to safely clean up. And the next time you cook a piece of meat before eating it, know that you're doing, with a flame and a pan, essentially the same job a vulture's stomach does automatically, every single day without ever needing to think about it at all.